Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we had the Duke trying to get back into the royal family without much success. He visited Queen Mary, and even though he wasn't supposed to mention Wallis Simpson, he did. And that didn't sit well with Queen Mary. The king talked to his brother for 2 hours and set him straight on a few things, since he was an ex-king. The Duke had thought of moving to the United States, but he ended up in France with him and Wallis for the rest of their lives. I like that the Queen was so involved in protecting the arts, and she had an exhibition of the royal artworks, and then had a private showing, and it was during that occasion she came up with an idea to build a gallery at Buckingham Palace, and it was done in 1962. So let's see what the royal family is up to today. The Queen remained interested in her regiments even after the war. In October 1945, she sent the Toronto Scottish a warm message as they made their journey back home. The Queen accepted the appointment of Colonel-in-Chief of the Black Watch of Canada. In early 1946, she was upset with the disbandment of the 5th Battalion. The war left the Queen with the feeling that Christianity was vital to the recovery of the country. She detested what she saw as the irreligious materialism of the Nazis and communist creeds, and was increasingly concerned with the decline in the traditional religious belief in Britain. Education seemed to her to be the key to reversing the trend. She was presented in 1944 to set up a center for the study of Christian philosophy of life. It was the brainchild of Amy Buller, and she wrote a book entitled Darkness Over Germany in 1943. She had been appalled by the ease with which the Nazis had seduced ordinary, decent Germans, and she felt that if such a civilized country as Germany could be so warped, Britain bore a similar risk. She thought the Western civilization was in decline because of the weakening of Christianity. The Queen loved the book and asked to meet the author, and they did meet in March 1944. Amy Buller called the meeting "my miracle." Buller was impressed by the Queen's enthusiasm and faith. She told the Queen she wanted to create a college to teach Christian principles. The Queen wanted to help. The most serious problem was to find a site. The Queen asked Queen Mary whether part of the Royal College of St. Catherine's in Regent Park, of which Queen Mary was a patron, could be used. Amy Buller hoped to attract teachers of psychology, science, and medicine, and other disciplines from universities all around the country, for many of them seemed to be almost pagans, and there seems to be absolutely nowhere clever people can go to study and discuss the Christian way of life from an intellectual angle. There seemed to be no home to be found for the college, but in 1947, Cumberland Lodge, a former royal residence in Windsor Great Park, fell vacant, and the King and Queen decided to offer it to Miss Buller's foundation. They lent furniture, pictures, and other household goods to the college, known first as St. Catherine's, Cumberland Lodge, and then it was renamed King George VI and Queen Elizabeth's Foundation of St. Catherine's in 1966. Miss Buller became warden, and Elizabeth Elphinstone, assistant warden. Sir Walter Moberly, who had been chairman of the University Grants Committee and was the author of The Crisis in the Universities, was appointed principal. He too was a firm believer in the value of Christian insight into academic studies. St. Catherine was and remains a Christian foundation, but it brought together those with widely divergent political and religious views. It promoted the civilized values which had arisen from the beginnings of Christianity. Its lasting success owes much to the Queen's patronage. In 1946, the consequence of war was the extreme poverty of the country. The Labour government promised to extend the state ownership and thus to build a new Jerusalem in Britain's green and pleasant land, but soon it turned into disappointment, and disillusion followed. London remained a wrecked city. Too often to the victors, their country seemed neither green nor pleasant. Bread during the war wasn't rationed, but after the war it was. All other foods, clothing, and fuels were in short supply, or even rationed. This led to a black market in post-war Britain. Those who had the cash got the goods. On the other hand, for millions of people in Britain, perhaps the majority, the post-war years were not overwhelmingly bleak. It was the first time in which they could feel security with full employment, national insurance, and national assistance, the advent of a national health service. There was rationing, but by contrast, with the years after the end of the World War, this meant that the poor could get food and limited goods were shared out more evenly. The Labour government was criticized, but it didn't lose a single by-election in the post-war years, and its vote in many working-class areas actually grew. The war had demonstrated Britain's dependence on soldiers from the Empire, and now Britain depended on the Empire for much of her food and raw materials. Royal tours to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and elsewhere were envisioned as a means of giving thanks to the peoples of the Dominions. South Africa was chosen as the first destination. The King and Queen and their daughters were invited to go to South Africa in 1946. This had a poignancy, according to the Queen, because it seemed unlikely that the four would remain a simple quartet for very long. When they left in early 1947, it was the most bitter winter in recent memory. The weather with the post-war rationing made Britain a truly wretched place. Big Ben and its workings froze solid, as did the Thames. Much of the production stopped. The ice and the snow forced the coal mines and ports to close. There was a fuel crisis and power cuts. Life was miserable, and when time came for the voyage, both the King and the Queen were reluctant to leave. The Queen read about both the history and the natural life of South Africa. She thought the journey would be complicated. South Africa wasn't automatically inclined toward Britain. The two races, Britain and the Dutch, competed with each other over their visions and shares of the country and their relationships with the huge indigenous black population, the Coloreds and the Indians. There were two capitals, Cape Town and Pretoria, two national anthems, and two national flags. The King and Queen felt that their purpose was to try and bring as much unity as possible to the divided nation. The King was invited to open Parliament in Cape Town. The King and Queen had lessons in Afrikaans, and the Queen took her for the voyage the list of phonetic equivalents of words and phrases given to her by her tutor. Norman Hartnell designed most of the clothes for her and her daughters. Her hats, designed by the Danish milliner Aggie Therup, introduced the swept-up brim, which the Queen liked because it didn't hide her face or her smile. The immediate household staff for the tour was numbered 10. The Queen took Lady Harlech and Lady Dahlia Peel as ladies-in-waiting, and Lady Margaret Egerton was lady-in-waiting to the princesses. The Queen also had 2 maids and her own hairdresser. An official tour diary was kept by the King's press secretary, Captain Louis Ritchie, R.N., and Ted Grove wrote long letters home to his wife, which formed a more intimate private diary of the trip. February 1st, 1947, they sailed from Portsmouth in HMS Vanguard, a new battleship which Princess Elizabeth had launched on Clydeside in 1944. Their quarters were more comfortable by the Queen's choice of soft furnishings and a familiar satinwood furniture borrowed from the royal yacht, and the Queen had her cine camera filming all of it. They had a rough time in their passage through the Bay of Biscay. The King and the 2 princesses kept to their cabins. On the 2nd and 3rd days, only the Queen felt strong enough to dine in the household. Ted Grove wrote back home that the Queen certainly looked better than he felt. By the 5th day, they passed the Azores with the warm weather, and the King and the Queen started to enjoy life on board ship. A friendly sense of fun and games developed. One night, under a full moon, the Queen, the 2 princesses, and Lady Margaret Egerton danced and ate some reel with 4 ship's officers on the quarter-deck. Princess Elizabeth reported to Croffey, "The officers were charming, and we have had great fun with them. There are 1 or 2 real smashers, and I bet you'd have a wonderful time if you were here." And she put "wonderful" in all caps. So there was a homegrown amusement on board. The ship's company gave a floor show one night, and on others Dahlia Peel played the piano for community singing, and films were shown in the King's dining room. The press photographers begged for something to reveal and captured the family party playing deck games with the naval officers. In the background, the royal parents, always dressed perfectly, watched their daughters. On calmer seas, the royal party was able to visit the escorting ships, including the aircraft carrier HMS Implacable, which the Queen had launched in Glasgow in 1942. The Queen had followed the voyages of her ship with warm interest. Implacable made a notable contribution to our final victory, and I need not say that it was with deep pride that I heard of her achievements. The holiday spirit was dampened by the King's growing anxiety about the news of the ever-worsening situation in Britain. He felt that having shared so many trials with his people during the war, he should be there now to show sympathy and solidarity with them. Princess Elizabeth wrote regularly to Queen Mary and admitted to their feelings of frustration. We hear of such terrible stories of the weather and the fuel situation at home, and I do hope you have not suffered too much. While we are dripping in the tropics, it's hard to imagine the conditions under which you were living. And I, for one, feel rather guilty that we've got to stay in the sun while everyone else was freezing. The king sent a telegram to Attlee suggesting that he should come home by air, and Attlee thought this would only increase a sense of national crisis and politely rejected the idea. But the king's feelings of guilt continued. I will end the video here. In this episode, the Queen took an interest in getting the people into Christianity after seeing how the Germans behaved during the war. She was successful setting up a center for education of the people. Next, the royal family went to South Africa, and South Africa was a divided nation, and the English and the Dutch were both trying to sway the country to them. At this time, though, the weather got uncharacteristically colder than normal. It was causing the people of England a terrible time. The trip had been planned in advance, and no one could have foreseen this weather thing occurring. The king and queen and the princesses felt bad about leaving their country while the weather was causing such havoc. The king even asked the prime minister if he could return home to be supportive of his people. The prime minister didn't think it would be a good idea, leaving people to think that there was a crisis, so the king stayed where he was. I love King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. They had a special bond with their fellow countrymen, and the war made them feel even closer to them. They still felt that way. The king and the queen still felt that way about their people, and it made them feel bad that they weren't there too. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help out the channel and help it to keep growing. Thank you for all of you new subscribers, and also a special thanks to all of you who have been with the channel since the beginning. I really appreciate it. As I have mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. And if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you purchase it, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. Now, I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.